Hello, Bhante Bodhidhamma.
Great to be here, Ludovic.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for accepting my invitation. And I'm really delighted to have you here today on the channel. You have been a Theravadan Buddhist monk since 1986.
Yeah.
You are a Dharma teacher in the tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, and you are the spiritual director of Satipanya Buddhist Retreat in England since 2002.
Yeah. Small correction there. I'm in
Yeah.
Wales.
Oh, in Wales.
Gales. Gales.
Okay. Um, for my first question, it's general question on your background.
Yes.
Could you
Yeah.
please share a bit about your story, your teachers, and why did you became and stayed a Buddhist monk?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful for this little opportunity. Thank you so much. Um, well, I was brought up a Catholic and I was very devotional, but something, I don't know, I wandered away from it around about the age of 21. Um, and that was 1968, which was a big year, really, with all the student riots. Going back a bit, it's almost prehistoric history now. And that put me in a very strange place because what, my whole life had depended upon was this loving God, etc., etc. That all disappeared. And I was very much attracted to existentialism. And the person I found that gave me greatest comfort was Albert Camus in
Mm.
his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. So he said life was meaningless, but it was worth making something of it. So that's what I did. Then about 10 years passed, and we could say that at this point, everything fell apart. Things like my marriage came to an end. I had no work, etc., etc. And I had read a book by a Catholic priest actually on Zen. So I got in touch with the Zen Center here in London and wanted to go to Japan. They put me off going to Japan and they put me in touch with somebody who was basically living a small bus ride away from me. So it was very convenient. So I started actually with Zen Buddhism. And I spent about 2 years, maybe a year and a half or 2 years. And through this teacher in Birmingham, Vajrayabhali, I was introduced to a Burmese monk. And through him, I eventually had my first Theravada retreat with who was then Ajahn Sumedho, Lumpur Sumedho, who brought the order of the Thai forest tradition to England. And that really took me to a place that the Zen hadn't done, which was very deep inside me. I became very much concerned with my, emotional states, really, mental states. And then the Mahasi turned up, the Mahasi Sayadaw. He was by then very famous in the East. And I finally did a retreat with one of his teachers, Sayadaw U Janaka, who then came to Britain every year for about 4 or 5 years. And this really suited me, this particular form of meditation. And I even went to Burma to spend some time with him, about 6 months. And then when I came back, I began to have this idea of really just leaving the lay life and spending some time, 3 years, as a monastic, and devoting myself entirely to this meditation, because that's what you can do. You could join the order, go to Burma, and just practice. And there was no conditions put on that. I didn't have to become an arahat in 3 years or anything like that. It was just an open invitation. It's absolutely marvelous. So I thought this is what I really wanted to do. And so it took a while. And then when I finally ordained in 86, as you say, really that was my intention. And I spent some time with my teacher in Birmingham, Dr. Rewata Dhamma, who died. And then I spent a year at Amaravati monastery, which is a big one in just north of London. And then I wanted to follow up this desire to go to Burma, but there'd been that terrible revolution there, not revolution, the students and ordinary people, I think that was the one where the monks came out on the streets against the military and were all killed. So it was very difficult to get into Burma. And so, because of a long story short, I ended up in Sri Lanka, where I settled into Kandabodha Meditation Center. I stayed there for about 8 years, off and on. And then when I came back to Britain in 98, I wasn't feeling so well. So I stayed here, and that's when the teaching began. After about 3 years, being a monastic, I realized that actually I needed more time. So I had to make a decision whether to go back to the lay life or remain a monk. So I thought, well, I'll try another 4 years. So I stayed for 7 years. Yeah. And then by that time, I found this place in Sri Lanka. And at the end of 7 years, I thought, well, if I stay a bit longer, I might go a bit deeper. So I carried on for I determined another 7 years. And by that time, of course, I was in my middle 50s. And I thought, well, what's the point of leaving? So I just stayed. And that's how I continued to be, to remain a monk. But, when I came back from Sri Lanka there was a bit of a doubt in my mind because I knew I didn't want to go back east again. And so I started this teaching, which at first I was quite averse to, but eventually I realized that if I wanted to remain in the order, this was the way to go. And I was very fortunate. I ended up being invited to be the resident teacher at Gaia House Meditation Center, south of England, which is a big place, And I look upon those 4 years as my Dharma teacher's training college. And it was there that I conceived of perhaps there was a place for a small meditation center for this sort of intensive meditation. You see, I mean, we stick fairly closely to the tradition. So, we're up at 3:30, go to bed at 10, sit, walk, sit, walk, sit, walk, until you're so tired you have to go to sleep. And what I discovered at Gaia House was that there was, not many people, maybe 150 a year, who would come to such a center. And that's where I'm at now. Yeah.
Okay. It's a lovely background because you had the chance to practice as you want.
Yeah. I mean, that's the benefit really of joining the order, even if it's only for a short time. The whole institution is there to support you. Yeah.
And could you elaborate on to go back to the fundamentals about the primary focus of the Buddhist teachings, and in that, what aspects of it do you emphasize?
Well, really, I'm a traditionalist, really. I mean, I just go back to the Four Noble Truths. And in Vipassana, what you're really investigating are these 3 characteristics of existence, impermanence, how we create suffering for ourselves, dependent origination, really, and the whole idea of not self. And in daily life, just to follow the Eightfold Path, specifically developing the social virtues of love, compassion, sympathetic joy, things like that. And also recognizing that it has to be grounded on equanimity. There has to be a way of, breathing out and stopping and just grounding yourself in the present moment in a quiet way. And then the next thing to be done, the next decision, the next intention, you see. And what I put particular stress on actually is what you might call the virtuous circle. It's gratitude, generosity, and renunciation. Now, in the commentaries, it says this can also lead directly to liberation. It doesn't. I don't think it says that in the scriptures, but it does say it in the commentaries. So when we consider how much we owe in terms of, even our mothers giving us our lives and et cetera, it's unrepayable. And what that leads you to is to be more generous with your time, with your wealth. And in so doing, of course, you have to give up those things that you would like to have done for yourself. And there's the renunciation. And so this lovely virtuous circle sort of twirls you towards nibbana. That's something I like to stress for daily life. An attitude of generosity. Yeah.
You talked about Vipassana. And maybe the listeners won't know the definition of this word and the core of the technique of the Vipassana meditation. Can you explain us what is Vipassana?
Yeah, Vipassana is made up of two words, passati, which just means to see, and vi just means really see. So in English, we would say to really understand, really see, and as sort of a direct experience of something. It's an insight. Yeah. So Vipassana practice is about having an insight into those very three characteristics of existence. It's a word which has really cuts across all the techniques. It doesn't matter what technique it is. If it's a Theravada technique, it would normally be referred to as Vipassana, or insight practice. That's also something that's often used. I suppose the real insight is to begin to recognize that everything that we're experiencing is actually up here in the head, and it's being projected into the world, and it's not as though the world out there doesn't exist, but what we experience of it is entirely generated through the sense faculties and the mind playing with it, and our emotional relationship to everything. And so the Buddha starts off the Dhammapada, which is this collection of verses, by saying that the mind is the chief, it's the forerunner. And what you're looking at when you go inward is how the mind is creating this world, basically. And what you really want to know is, where am I getting it wrong? Why am I suffering? Because what the Buddha is saying is that the suffering isn't imposed upon us. That doesn't mean to say there aren't unpleasant situations, that the body doesn't give us pain and all that. But how we relate to that creates this level of suffering, which normally splits into not getting what we really want, always wanting a bit more, and just pushing away or running away from what we don't want. And so we're in constant conflict with the world, the world as we experience it, not the world as it really is out there. It's just, this is our own take on reality. Might be a nice way to put it. That Vipassana, there's a little phrase in the discourses, which translates as to see and understand the way things really are. But it's actually, that's how it's normally translated. But the direct translation from the Pali would be to see and understand how things have come to be. In other words, we're looking at process. Everything is arising and passing away, and yet everything is interconnected and interdependent. And that's basically what we're looking at. And the teaching around not self is concerned with recognizing, I mean, this is the core scripture there on anatta, recognizing that if it's arising and passing away, it can't be substantial and it can't be me, because once I attach to something and it's disappeared, it can't be me anymore. Something new turns up. So Vipassana is that sort of investigation. And as we do that, there comes this realization, a slow awakening, you might say, that whatever is doing the investigation is not actually part of what it's investigating. So there's this distancing, from what we're actually experiencing. And what it is that's distancing from it is the very thing we're looking for, which is that very awareness. And that's the awakening part. And it sort of dawns upon us just through seeing the practice, just through looking at something in a particular way. So that's the purpose of Vipassana, is to lead us to that experience of something in us, which the Buddha calls the deathless. So,
and there's a technique in the Mahasi tradition, which is the noting or noticing. Could you explain how does it work?
Yeah, people are often critical of the noting, but really we're noting all the time. I mean, you've only got to watch yourself. As soon as you see a fruit, you'll say to yourself banana or orange. So it's not as though there's a part of the mind which is constantly labeling, and through that label puts something into a particular category. When you see something you've never seen before and there's no word for it, then of course you're in a bit of confusion and you have to find a word for it. You always ask somebody, what is it? So it's not as though labeling isn't going on all the time. In the Mahasi tradition, you make it obvious. You actually speak a word which points to what you're experiencing, knowing that the word doesn't actually hit your experience head on. It can't be a direct experience because it's always a concept. It's always something that we've manufactured. So when we're watching the breath, say the rising and falling of the abdomen, which is preferred mainly because it keeps you in the body, and of course the impermanence is much more obvious in a way than the actual breath of the nostrils. So when you are noting rising, that word is pointing to something that you're experiencing, but it's not the experience. The experience is the direct feeling of the abdomen. So at first, a meditator might find that this word is right in front of them. They can't seem to feel the breath because they keep saying rising. And what that tells the meditator is that this intuitive awareness is confused, is identified with the intellect. And by drawing your attention constantly to the feeling body, the sensing body, that awareness draws itself away out of the intellect, and the noting becomes like a background thing. And you're much more in direct contact with what you're actually experiencing, which is some level of feeling, right? Emotional, mental, or physical feeling. So the noting word has that ability to do that. The second thing is that the noting, of course, points to something. So that makes it an object. And it begins to dawn on the meditator that the perceiver cannot be the perceived. There's a distinction, right? So there you're moving into anatta. But the noting itself is not an aim in itself. The idea is, of course, that your concentration, your steadiness of attention, your focus is steady enough that you can drop the noting. I mean, that's the idea of it. It's not as though you do it ad infinitum. So it's just a skillful way of bringing you into that place where you can really investigate what's actually happening. On top of that, there's going slow. So when you go slow, the whole machine slows down. Now, interestingly enough, when I used to go up to Throstle Abbey, which was a Zen center in North England, we did everything at speed. We just run around, and there the teaching was, if you're not absolutely concentrating on what you're doing, you're going to drop something, you're going to trip over, you're going to bang yourself, you're going to hurt somebody else. So the idea was there that you did something at speed, but without the sense of rush. And that would keep your mindfulness. It also built up your energy so that when you sat in Zazen, you didn't need an object because you had the energy, you had the concentration from work, you see. So you'd sit there and sometimes your mind would be still. At other times, of course, it just wandered. So in this tradition, you slow everything down. And of course, I think that's a lot to do with climate. Parts of Japan are extremely cold, whereas, the East is just so hot. And slowing down just makes a lot of sense anyway. But this slowing down is really, really slow. And it has the effect of just slowing down the whole process. And that means that you can see things more clearly. That's all. So these two techniques sort of fit into each other. The walking, you do very, very slowly, mainly to gain a sense of a good steadiness of attention, but you're also watching impermanence, the foot rising and falling. You bring that into the sitting with you, And the third thing is to note intentions. So the slower you go, the more you see how the mind is always ahead of itself. And to be able to draw yourself into the present moment, see that intention coming up, even the intention to open a door, right? It goes down to even minutiae, intending to open the door. And the more you do that throughout the day, the more you find yourself actually right in the present moment. So these three techniques sort of support each other. And that would be how the Mahasi developed his particular process.
You talked about also the anatta or the not self or non-self teaching. I have the impression that it's maybe a very subtle notion. Can you just explain what it means?
Well, the Buddha, when he met his 5 companions, the first talk was really a conversation about what he'd actually experienced. It became formalized in the discourse on the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. But when you read the discourses, you see it was a conversation he had with them. And the one question he keeps asking is, have you ever heard me speak like this? Anyway, according to the story, they go off for arms round, and when they come back, he gives them yet another talk. And this one is about this core problem of identity. Who are we? Or better still, what are we? And the discourse, Anatta, really just lays it out. He's never saying there is no self. That'd be ridiculous. Everybody experiences a self. What he's asking is, if there is a self, is it real? Now, this word atta is actually better translated as soul, because he's arguing that, if there is something in us which is eternal, which doesn't suffer, doesn't change, is completely independent of all phenomena and material universe, what is it? So it's a sort of quest. It's an investigation. And he starts off by simply saying, look, if this body is, if something is my soul, I must have control over it. If I haven't got control over it, something else has got control over it. So it can't be me. So he says the body. He says, if you've got control of your body, well, to a certain point I can wave my arm about, but I can't stop it getting old, I can't stop it dying, etc., etc. And then he goes through the other, what we call the 5 khandhas, about feeling, about your mind, about thinking, concepts and all that, about all your habits, how much control have you got over your habit. And finally, consciousness, which in the five khandhas is actually just a screen. That's all it is. It doesn't have any intelligence or anything. It's just a screen upon which information arises. And then the next question about, well, if it is a soul, would it arise and pass away? Would it change? So then he goes through again these five parts of what we would call the psychophysical organism and asks us, is there anything that doesn't change? So if it changes, if it arises and passes away, that obviously can't be an eternal soul. And then the final thing is, if we think it is, will that cause us suffering? So there's your identity with this psychophysical organism. And what that does is make you begin to realize, or make the effort of seeing everything as an object. Now, I like to use what happens to us when we're born. So when we're born, seemingly for about 4 months, we're just bombarded with information, with data, and we can't make any head or tail of it. But we do know what's pleasant and unpleasant. We're born directly into the world of pleasure and pain, you know. After 4 months, we have our carer, mother, usually a mother, begins to form within this catastrophe of information. And it takes about 3 years for that child to push everything out and be very clear, this is me and everything is not me. So that identity of who they are takes something like 3 years. Now, what we're doing is we're going inside ourselves and we're pushing the internal world outward as an object. And in so doing, we're discovering what it is within that world, that mental, physical world, which doesn't belong there. That's the process. Mm-hmm. And the other image I use is Narcissus. Narcissus, as you know, looks into the pool. He sees this beautiful young man, so he falls in love with it and he embraces it. So that image is what's happening on the screen of your consciousness. And it mirrors back to you your sense of awareness, which is that sense of presence that you have inside you. And you enter into the world of the mind through that presence. This is me, and this is mine. And what we're doing now is getting Narcissus. He didn't drown, he just got lost. We're getting him out of the pond and sitting him back onto the bank of that pond. So our process is this distancing, this realization of distance between what is doing the observing and investigating and what is being observed and being investigated. So the perceiver cannot be the perceived. That's the thing. However, we come to a point where we still feel ourselves to be the observer. Now, you can't be that either because you're aware of it. Getting beyond that, of course, is not within our willpower. And what we have to do is keep observing, until one day we pop, and then we have this experience of who we really are. So that's the process of anatta, you might say.
That's really clear. And what's needed to attain this realization? Is it needed to have a daily formal meditation practice, and or can one have this realization in one sitting or in 2 sittings as a beginner, for example?
Well, it very much depends upon your karma, on what you've brought into the present moment. Very few of us are pure of heart enough to have it immediately you sit. I'm sure it happens to one or two people, but usually we've got a big mess to get through. And the purification of the heart runs in tandem with the insight. So you can't end up with a neurotic Buddha. That wouldn't feel right. So a lot of our process is allowing these mental turbulences, the fears, the angers, the depressions, the greeds, the lust, to arise and exhaust themselves. And I think one of the core moments for a meditator, a beginner, is to have the experience where they sit with a difficult emotional mental state, watch it slowly evaporate, and if possible, if they can stay right to the end, they see the transformation into an opposite. And if a meditator has that experience, it gives them so much confidence in the practice, because they realize that the heart purifies itself. All they've got to do is open up to it and bear with it, to be patient with it. So as the heart purifies itself, the awareness becomes more sharp, it becomes clearer, and insights arise. Insights which can be just very simple, insights into how we're operating, our habits, insights on how we can work with the habit to, we say, a habit we don't want, how we can work with it to lessen it slowly but surely. But eventually there are these, 4 stages of attainment. Now, what we call stream entrant, once returner, non-returner, and finally an arahat. And at the first attainment, nothing much changes on a personal level. It's more to do with an insight into our true nature. And the Buddha talks about it as a flash of lightning. It's just a moment, but it's enough to have undermined the view of self. But it doesn't do much about the sense of self. You still feel very much to be me. It's very subtle. But somehow there has been that little crack, and it opens up, it makes you more clear about the path. So whatever you thought was the path before, you might find actually you can still use it, but it's not really what's going to get you liberated. But they usually put it down as, rituals and stuff like that. So ritual has its place, but if you think it's going to make you, fully liberated, then it's not going to work. And the final one is, of course, that you lose all doubt in the Buddha's teachings, because now you've experienced it yourself. And those moments are usually life-changing for people. They can look back at that moment and see how their life changed. It re-geared itself, repositioned itself. And in the second one, that's when you have more of a purification, where you lose a lot of the energy that's around greed and aversion, but you're not really free of the sensual world until you become a non-returner. And that's why they're non-returners. They're not drawn into the sensual world anymore. And then after that, really, you're heading to a place where you're undermining that core problem of identity, the loss of conceit, the loss of I am, however you want to end that sentence. That's the delusion. So that doesn't come to the bitter end. So, we're on the Buddha did say it was a gradual path. And I remember reading, somebody complained to him and said, this path is hard and it's long. And he said, yes, but at the end you achieve Nibbana. And the questioner says, Nibbana, so what? He says, well, when you get there, you are contented and with it happy. So,
can everyone attain this level of attainment?
Well, it's open to everybody. I mean, that would be that would be an absolute in Buddhism, because at this sort of level, everybody is the same. Everybody has this awareness. Everybody has this intuitive awareness. Everybody has Buddha nature. And everybody is seeking liberation from suffering. Even President Putin, it's all a bit twisted in his head. He's put his love in a very strange place, the greatness of Russia and all that. But even he, in his own way, is trying to bring an end to suffering. So it's there. But most of us are, well, a bit delusive, I suppose, as to where we can find this liberation. Yeah.
Well, you talked about the four stages to become a arahat.
Yes.
What is this word, arahat?
Arahat just means someone who's liberated from suffering. So it could be liberated from all desires. He's killed all desires. That's one way of explaining it. But it's also somebody who has unshackled this awareness, taken the chains off. And that's why we call them these 10 fetters. Okay, so the process is getting rid of these chains, unfettering this awareness. And of course, you then come back. You're a very ordinary person. It's not as though you're glowing and levitating and all that sort of stuff. You might, if you had those practices, but generally speaking, you're just an ordinary person, but you haven't got this delusive way of looking at the world. I mean, there are people who achieve that, the one that I was very much impressed by was Ajahn Mahabua, who was a very famous monk in Thailand. But it was one of his pupils, Mechi Kiao, who I think really expresses what it is to be an arahat. And she says that basically whatever arises in her mind, in her body, she never gets lost in. Mm-hmm. It's always something that she is with. And so it's impossible for her to suffer. But she died very elderly, 91, 92, from lung cancer. So it wasn't as though she didn't suffer, the pain of old age and dying. But inwardly, this awareness, this intuitive awareness, did not react. It was just bearing with the situation, as the Buddha did himself. He died of this gastroenteritis, didn't he? Poisoning. Can't have been very pleasant.
You talked about stages, and Mahasi Sayadaw wrote a treatise named The Progress of Insight.
Yes.
With some stages.
That's right.
The various stages the meditator go through in his experience. Do you what are these stages, and do you use them in your teachings?
Well, this is an interesting question. My teacher, at the end of a retreat, this is Sayadaw Janaka. Later, I worked also with Sayadaw Upandita. At the end of a retreat, he might say, where are you? Do you know where you are in the stages of insight? Well, of course, nobody knew what they were really. And I myself wasn't particularly interested. I was more involved in all this emotional turmoil that I was trying to work through. So I tend not to talk about them, because what I find is that when people know these stages, they're looking for them. But they're not under our control. You can't get them for wishing them. They arise naturally when the time is ripe. So I found such things to be quite counterproductive. And I do get people coming here from other teachers who have got that in their head. Mm-hmm. And I can see they're over-efforting. And I keep telling them, forget it, relax, And often I fail because they're so caught up in. Now, when I was myself meditating, when I went to Burma, there was somebody who became a friend, And he had got into this, achieving business. And I remember during that retreat, he'd spent months, 3 months at a time, doing this very heavy meditation. And I remember him saying to me on that retreat, he shouldn't have been talking to me, of course, but we had a little chat, saying to me that he'd got so far and that was it. He felt he couldn't go any further, and he stopped practicing, and many years later, he'd got himself into a really bad situation and he pulled himself out happily. But put it this way, to read the stages and then to know that they're there and then to throw the book away, right? You might have the confidence that there is actually a clearly delineated path. Now, having said all that, that's not the only way you can become liberated. This is the point. You don't have to achieve liberation through the Vipassana jnanas, as they're known, the insights of Vipassana. And frankly, anybody who has a out-of-body experience, and I mean the sort of experience where you hear people have a near-death experience, where the awareness shoots out of the body, looks down. And when you ask them, well, what's this awareness made of? It's not made of anything. It's immaterial. It doesn't have anything to it. And yet it sees the body and the mind in front of it, the person, Well, that's a deep insight. That's, in a sense, you're lucky. I must tell you a tale. A woman came and a boyfriend seems to have gone into some sort of psychosis and attacked her and held her by the neck, on a grip. And she says she was losing her breath. She couldn't breathe. She kept pleading with him and all that, And at one moment, she thought she was actually going to die. And this very thing happened to her. She shot out of her body. And it changed her life. And so instead of being angry with this boyfriend, she was very grateful. Of course, she broke off the relationship, but she thought, my goodness, what a gift. So you can, and there's also, I would say, a path of love that the Buddha did not really push, but I think it's in there somewhere through metta. And I think that this trilogy of gratitude, generosity, and renunciation also produces a path of the heart rather than a path of insight. The one feeds the other, because you've got right understanding, right attitude. So the attitude's coming from the heart. And the attitude will feed back into your understanding, No.
So I understand maybe the path of insight or Vipassana meditation alone, maybe it's not sufficient for having the realization of awakening.
I know, I think it's very rare, but if somebody had already the virtues needed, they could go to the forest, go to a quiet place, a secluded place, and just continue doing Vipassana, walking, sitting meditation until they made it. Now, there's a little interesting little story in the scriptures where these young monks approached the Buddha and said, we go to people like Sariputta. And he says, if you want to become liberated, you must really understand the Dharma and practice. But when they go to somebody like, what's his name? It'll come to me. He says, oh, well, no, you have to keep the rule very strictly and do the practice. They're a little bit confused as to what the path is. So the Buddha says to them, well, a teacher will teach you the way they came, right? And so they say to the Buddha, well, what would you advise us to do? And he says, meditate, meditate, meditate. So he already had what we call the parami, these virtues, these perfections. And it's interesting that when he has the great doubt, what we call the great doubt, when he's sitting there, and he wonders what the hell he's doing. I mean, it's mythically told as Mara attacking him, you know. But he's wondering what he's doing, why he's doing it, where he's going, etc. Again, mythologically, the earth goddess rises and said, you know, says to Mara that this bodhisattva, because he's not a Buddha yet, has every right to become liberated because he has perfected the virtue of generosity. In other words, he's not doing it just for himself. No.
You talk about scriptures, and as a teacher, do you have a favorite one, a favorite sutra or text that you find meaningful?
Yeah, well, there's a lot really, but I suppose I tend to have a sort of you could call it a sense of joy because I used to chant the first three discourses, the one on the rolling of the wheel of the Dhamma, the one on anatta, and the one that's known as the fire sermon, where he talks about everything being caught up in the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, you know. And I used to chant those, so they're very inspirational for me. And I lost the habit, and I keep telling myself I ought to, you know, chant them again. But those three discourses say everything. And once you've understood those, all the other scriptures begin to make sense, you know. And I suppose one that is quoted quite widely is the one about Bahia of the Baha. I mean, it's just a lovely story where he just clicks. And it would seem, from what I understand, through the research that people have done, he wore this bark cloth because he belonged to a certain sect of Brahmins who kept talking about the knower and the feeler and all that. So he was looking for this knower, this feeler. And the Buddha, in his way, just cut through that. And once he cut through it, that was it. He was liberated from the delusion of who he really was. So yeah, I mean, there's lots. Shall yes?
That's my favorite one.
Yeah,
the Bahia.
The Bahia.
It's a very, very popular one. Also.
It is. A lot of, you know, it's quoted everywhere. So it gives you a lot of hope, I think, you know.
What advice would you offer to individuals seeking an authentic teacher or an authentic teaching? Because one can be easily misled.
Well, normally if you find someone who's already in a tradition, you're normally pretty safe because they're an expression of that tradition. So anybody who is teaching according to the Mahasi tradition would have other teachers who are teaching, etc., etc. I mean, that way at least safeguards you from somebody who has discovered a new path by themselves, you know. That's always a bit dodgy. Not to say that they haven't. And then I think you've got to just keep a slight distance from the teacher. You know, I remember once with my first teacher, Rewata Dhamma, I did have a sense of warmth towards him. And on one occasion, I sat there in front of him and I looked upon him lovingly with kindly eyes. That's what the Buddha says. And there was a lot of gratitude in my heart. When we left and we did walking meditation, when I came back he came and sat with us. He sat on the other side of the shrine, away from me. See? And that's a sign of a good teacher, a teacher who doesn't want an intimate relationship of any sort. He you know, they remain aloof. They're not caught up in your emotional state. Very much the same as any therapist, any doctor. You know, if a doctor said to you, you know, you've got this terrible cancer, you've only got 6 weeks to live, you wouldn't expect the doctor to fall about crying. You know, you expect that professional distance. So that's you know, and I think some people get caught up in that emotional relationship. Yeah. And if you see that happening to yourself, and you see yourself becoming a favorite of the teacher, you know, we say teacher's pet, you know, like a pet is a dog, your dog is a pet, right. So teacher's pet, as soon as you see yourself moving into that area, then there's a danger that you'll be exploited, that you'll be abused, you know. And of course, a good teacher should be aware when they are particularly attracted to somebody and make sure they, you know, they do pull back. So, yeah, that's about it, really.
Yeah. I've got a last question.
Sure.
It's about concentration. Because there's a lot of schools of teaching where there's an emphasis on this teaching of you have to concentrate, samatha, etc. How do you envision this concentration teachings?
Yeah. Well, there are two types of people in the scriptures. One is called the sort of dry way, the insight way, the insight only way. Some monks say that they've only done the insight, and whatever jhana, whatever absorption they have experienced, it's within Vipassana. So in his book, In This Very Life, Sayadaw U Pandita has sort of pointed out that at certain levels where insights come on this path of insights, that your concentration must be at the same level as a particular jhana. And the distinction is that when you're practicing absorption meditation, it's on a single subject, and you become absorbed in that. It can even be a color, you know. It can be devotional practice, you know. Christians, for instance, Christian monks do a lot of devotional practice and get into beautiful mental states. What the Buddha would say is that those states in themselves, these are deep absorption states, don't bring about insight because you've put aside the intuitive intelligence. So this Buddha within has these two parts. It has the awareness, which is receiving the information, and the intuitive intelligence, which grasps it. And what you do in, shall we say, in jhana, absorption, is to put away your desire to know anything and to just enjoy. And that's very relaxing, very empowering. But then when you come back, you bring in that sense of investigation. So if you've got the ability to do jhana and move into vipassana, then they are great aids. Great aid. There's no doubt about that. However, you know, for people generally, and including myself, I never really got into jhana as such. But for lay people especially, where you need time to do this jhana business, unless you have a natural capacity, you can just practice the vipassana. And then, of course, the effort is to bring that concentration into the present moment, constantly relaxing into the present moment. It's not a big effort. You're not pushing. It's relaxing into the present moment and becoming interested. So this sense of curiosity with the sense of calmness, relaxation, draws your focus. You don't have to work at it. You don't have to work at concentration. You've only got to think of the times in your life when you've been interested in something. Have you ever had any problem with concentration? Okay? So that's it. So it's really, building up this real want to understand how we operate and how we get it wrong. Now, there is, of course, a tradition of concentration meditation taught by Ayakema. And I think also Vimalaransi, I think, the monk in America who died recently. And there's also his students, Delson Armstrong and other teachers who all teach a much more lighter, and that's probably, I haven't done it myself. That's probably possible, I think, rather than this sort of absorption business,
Yes, it's you relax the grip at each time you go away. You relax the grip of stress. Or
that's it. That's it. That's it. That's the renunciation. Constantly renounce. Yeah. So if you can do it, fine. If you can't, you have to do Mahasi.
Okay. Thank you for the advice. We are reaching the end of this interview,
yes.
And I really want to thank you for your time and your generosity. And I will take care of creating the subtitles in French for French listeners that can't understand English. And again, thank you for your teaching.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ludovic. It's been a lovely hour.
Okay, bye.
Peace and joy.
Bye.